through travel, through engagement. So we do work with preschools. That's where I'm coming from. We have a program called Jumpstart. That's a preschool literacy program. Those of you who are from Worcester or the area know that Worcester's a gateway city, so we're doing some literacy work, and that's a terrific program. But we do some travel as well. Margaret's on my Facebook, so she knows last year I took a group down and we did some environmental work in Big Pine Key, Florida, which was a nice trip. That's the lower Keys, just around Key West, Somerset Key. And believe it or not, we're going to go back there because we worked on this grove. It was a really interesting project. I should present on some of my projects, but next time. We were replanting a grove that this scientist had made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s before he passed away, and then it fell into disrepair. It became kind of a junkyard. And this group called Growing Hope was reestablishing it. And we went down and helped them, rebuild the fence and plant, and we had a great week down there. It was near some nice beaches, which the students really loved as well. But believe it or not, the Eye of Irma passed directly over where we were working. Patrick Garvey, the director of the program, actually shot some video. He stuck it out in his shelter. And so we're going to go back there again. So all that's a long way of saying, my days of lecturing on Thoreau, well, they're back again. So thanks to Margaret. It was really great to go back because I did teach American literature, and we used to go to Concord every year with the Nichols students and see the grave where Henry's buried on Author Ridge there. Some of you may have been there. And Concord, and of course the Walden site and the Emerson House. So it was great to revisit some of this by Margaret's invitation. But all that's a long way of saying for the last 7 years I've been doing civic engagement, which again Henry might roll over in his grave thinking about, because he was a bit of a misanthrope in some respects. But we'll talk about that. He was kind of complicated like a lot of people are. But I'm just kind of warming up the room. Did you want to say something first, or?
Well, I think you did a great introduction and a really good overview on how we got to know each other. It's really a great pleasure to be able to bring people to the community, people who have strong connections to Southbridge and this area. And I would think Mark Wagner is one of those people. And it was really great to be able to reach out and to ask him to come in another iteration to Southbridge. He has presented here many times with his poetry and run a writing group actually here at the library. So it's really nice to be able to go back and forth with different presenters and highlight their talents. And as we're at the last stages of the 200th birthday of Thoreau, it's really a great pleasure to invite Mark back and to give us some of Thoreau's local connections, because Central Massachusetts obviously was very important to Thoreau. So I just want to just maybe say that Dr. Mark Wagner is here with us this evening. He has been to, he's talking about his travels and stuff like that, but he hasn't mentioned that he's been in Australia and been there for at least about a year. He was in China for another year, and these were all periods during which I knew him and his wife and his son. And I just think that it's a family unit as well. They have a big history in the area, and they do lots of wonderful things as a group, as a three-person family, and I just want to commend you for that. And I think it is very much a la Thoreau, despite what you might think. I just think it fits in with, sustainable living and stuff like that, which Mark and his family are dedicated to as well. So as part of our Walktober series as well, we are presenting this program, and it's probably the third program I think that we've presented this year, and we really try to also reach out to our neighbours in nearby Connecticut and connect down the Oxytocin River Valley, which we are a member and we're very proud of. And I think talking about Henry David Thoreau this evening would be well in keeping with that whole environmental connection as well. So without any further ado, let's get a warm Southbridge welcome to Mark Wagner.
Apropos, the photographs from Quabbin, I was just looking at nature photographs from Dale. Those are beautiful. So yeah, thank you. It was really great. I say yes like I do to most things when Margaret wrote to me, and then about a week or 10 days ago I started thinking, well, what am I going to say about Thoreau? I used to be very much steeped in Thoreau. I used to teach Thoreau every term in American literature at Nichols. I haven't been doing that for years, but I used to take the students to Concord Museum and the Old Manse and the Emerson House, and we used to walk in the footsteps of Henry Thoreau. So, but then about a week ago or 10 days ago, I started thinking, well, what am I going to say? And it really was amazing, actually, how how these things go. I think I made a discovery in some respects about Thoreau that I hadn't really thought about before, and that's really what I want to talk about. So Thoreau did have a relationship. In fact, some people say he walked over to Webster Lake a number of times, but there's no document of that. What's documented is, of course, he hiked up to Wachusett a number of times, and he saw Wachusett as kind of a platform so he could look back over eastern Mass and out west, and he has this beautiful reflection at one point on east and west and what that means. We may or may not get that, because that is in this essay. So the discovery, let me see how I'm going to go about this, but the discovery I made was that he worked on one essay for pretty much his whole life. So from that first walk to Wachusett with his friend Robert Fuller in 1942, he began writing about walking. And a few years after the hike to Wachusett, he published a little something on walking. And then he kept on revising it again and again and again. And Thoreau was an amazing, what you say, a prodigious walker. I think he walked everywhere. In fact, I was joking before about the name tags. Thoreau was a bit misanthropic, and you probably have heard this about him, that if you bored him on a walk, he would start to walk faster. And yeah, he was just like, because he's a tall, gangly guy. And so you had to keep, his company had to, keep his mind occupied, otherwise he would just kind of take off. So perhaps not as social as I'd like this talk to be. But anyway, the point is that he kept on revising this essay and then gave it again in Fitchburg. So I'm going to talk about Wachusett, Worcester, and Fitchburg. Although, again, he was known to walk around here and came to Webster Lake apparently a few times. But he gave the talk again in 1957, so 15 years after his hike up Wachusett, his first hike up Wachusett. 1857. And then he fell into ill health, right? He like his brother, had tuberculosis, and sent it to the Atlantic Monthly, the essay that he worked on for 17 years or so. Sent it to the Atlantic Monthly. He published it just after he passed away in 1862. So that's here. You can get this online. I'm sure it's here in the library, but this is the whole polished essay that he worked on for like 17 years. So as I was thinking about tonight and tonight's talk, and again, thanks to Margaret, I was looking at walking because I knew he'd written about walking, and then I started to discover that this is kind of like was his central piece. He was most proud of this essay. So we know Walden, we know Life in the Woods, we know perhaps the civil disobedience when he was locked for one night in a jail over refusing to pay taxes for the Mexican War and whatnot. But the discovery I made in preparing for tonight was that this is kind of like what he was most proud of producing, this essay on walking. So I'm going to talk about this. And it has to do with Central Mass. It has to do with that first hike up Wachusett. He would come out and lecture on slavery and abolition in Worcester. In fact, he lectured more often in Worcester than anywhere else, which is kind of interesting. And then in Fitchburg, again, late in his life, 1957, gave this talk on walking and polished this until the end when he published it in the Atlantic Monthly. And this is available to you. And this is the opening words of this beautiful, beautiful essay on walking. And again, I want this to be interactive, so don't let me just kind of talk at you. Please, let's feel free to talk. I mean, are there any walkers in the room?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah? Did you walk a lot?
That's all I do is walk.
It's all you do. And, all right, so you didn't fill out a name tag yet. Are you like Thoreau? You want to keep private? And
Well, I don't like to pay taxes.
That's,
I
yeah.
support Mexicans, though, I'm fine with that.
Okay, all right, we're clear on that. Well, that's good. I mean, who does like to pay taxes? What's that? Not the Mexicans. Well, it's certainly an interesting discussion. Well, there's a connection right there, right? The Mexican-American War, which Thoreau is protesting, and of course we have our president, Donald Trump, who's promising tax reform and trying to keep the Mexicans out, I guess. I don't know. But what is your name?
Bob.
Bob. And so why do you walk so much?
Man has been walking since he walked upright.
Mhm.
I don't know, it's part of me.
All right,
I can't think of a life without walking.
Can't think of life without one.
I was laid up once in my life for about 3 months, and that was traumatic,
Uh-huh.
to just go everywhere on crutches.
Yeah. No, I
You
can't
limit your
imagine.
distance, you try to avoid stairs, you would not do anything you didn't have to do.
Mhm.
You would do multiple tasks with one trip,
Mhm.
and I don't know, I remember that was 30 years ago. So,
Wow.
but otherwise, yeah.
And so you walk every day?
Yeah, pretty much.
How many miles would you say you walk a day?
I don't keep track. I did have a pedometer for a while,
Uh-huh.
and after running it around so many times, you just, yeah, it doesn't matter.
Does anyone use a Fitbit when they're walking? Maureen uses a Fitbit? And how much are you walking?
Oh, one day I got like 62,000 steps.
Wow.
We walked 21 miles
21 miles.
from Harper's Ferry, West Virginia
Oh, well.
to, oh, no, from someplace, something Gap, Chester's Gap to Harper's Ferry, West Virginia. On the
Oh, the
Appalachian
Appalachian
Trail,
Trail?
yeah.
So we're going to talk about Harper's Ferry.
Oh, great.
Yeah. Amazing. So why do we walk? I mean, so Thoreau in this essay presents walking as a kind of a philosophical exercise in itself. So walking and thinking are kind of synonymous. Can you think, Maureen, when you walk, do you think?
I meditate and I pray.
Meditate and pray.
And think.
Okay. So, and Bob?
I thank God for every step.
Thank God for every step.
There's been millions of them.
There's been millions, yeah. So Thoreau, and we'll talk more about this as we go, but he saw walking as a way of kind of merging with nature, right? That's how you moved into nature. Well, you weren't separate, right? When you walked, you were part of nature, moving through nature, and that this brought an awareness, right? And the awareness was what Thoreau was after, right? He thought that walking was a type of purification, right? So as you walked and thought and pray, or whatever it is you do, that you are purifying yourself so that you can accept nature, and accepting nature, you get yourself a right in some way. Because in Thoreau's view, society is what screws us up. Right? Excuse my language, right? So society and mankind, our fellow men, right, will lead us astray, right? And Thoreau would walk into nature to get himself right. And I want to talk about that because it's quite an interesting idea, quite a radical idea in some respects. But this is how that essay begins. I wish to speak a word for nature, for absolute freedom and wildness, as contrasted with a freedom and culture merely civil. To regard man as an inhabitant or a part and parcel of nature rather than a member of society. I wish to make an extreme statement, if so I may, make an empathic one. For there are enough champions of civilization, the minister and the school committee and everyone, you will take care of that. So this is the beginning of walking, and he's saying that he wants to make an extreme statement, if we allow him, but an empathic one, to say that true freedom exists in nature and wildness. So we could be on the school committee, we could be champions of civilization, the minister and the school committee, but Thoreau in this essay, again thanks to Margaret, the discovery I've made this week, or in my own reading, obviously a Thoreau scholar is probably way ahead of me on this, but this is his magna opus. This is the piece he thought was most central to his thinking, right? And I don't know, does that surprise you at all? Are there any Thoreau scholars in the room? Have you read, like, Walden?
Yeah.
You've read Walden, Life in the Woods, and have you visited Walden? And we, in society, in literary society, we hold that up as kind of like his masterpiece, although it was always hard to get the students to read Walden. I mean, Walden's kind of dense, isn't it? I mean, it's...
You have to take him out to the hut, the replica of the hut that he had.
Yeah, there's the replica.
And have them sit around it, and then you can lecture.
Yeah, well, I would do that.
Because they can imagine living in a place so small.
Yeah, we would do that. We would go out there and look at Walden, which he wrote so beautifully about the eye of nature, the ponds were the eye of nature, and so on. And he talked about Walden, there's those beautiful moments where he talks about the sympathy between the ponds, right? Because there was Walden and White's Pond and other ponds around, and he over the 2 years that he lived there, right, 2 years, 2 months, and 2 weeks, he noticed that the ponds were in a sympathy, right? So when one would go down, all of them would go down, and when one would go up, all of them would go up. And he talked about the kind of a music between the ponds, right? Walden, beautiful, beautiful book. And then, of course, you all know, are familiar with Civil Disobedience. And those are the two works that we've always been taught, right? Has anyone read Walking? So that kind of interests me in its own
I
way.
wanted to ask you about that. You said he added to it periodically over the 20 years?
Yeah.
Now, do you know how many times did he separate each entry, or did he date it, or did he...
It's really quite interesting because Walden is, 2 and 3 page entries. It's like economy and, laundry and food and society. Walden's broken up every 2 or 3 pages into these short little chapters. This is one continuous little symphonic piece. Real music to it. So isn't that unusual or unique that, after many years, and Thoreau grows in stature, right? We're aware of that, right? I mean, in terms of world philosophy, Thoreau, and that's why I think we're celebrating him. In terms of world philosophy, Thoreau his stock is rising. Thoreau is seen internationally as a very, very key figure, right? Why is that? Why would that be?
Man is seeking fellowship with nature?
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Or the attempt to find it?
Yeah, more and more. You've heard about this trend in Asian countries where the Asian countries are very, strict and urban and whatnot. Now they have this movement now about forest immersion. You've heard about this?
Yeah.
So people are paying real money. So Bob, your career may be here, or my career may be here. People are paying real money to be immersed in the forest, right, to get that sense of nature. So certainly Thoreau is way ahead of the game there, right? He was born in 1817 and lived a relatively short life, dying in 1862. The family was, I guess tuberculosis is what killed both his brother and Thoreau himself. He had just before the walk to Wachusett, 4 years before, he had established the Concord Academy with his brother John. And I don't know if you all know that story at all. You all know the background between that. So they established a Concord Academy, and there is still a Concord Academy today, actually, although not the same one that Thoreau's established. And it was successful. They ran it successfully for 4 years. John was more social, more civil than Henry, but then John got sick and died. And Henry couldn't imagine running the academy alone. And he began his walking, he began his travels, and never really held a job after that. He made pencils, quote unquote, and lived in the woods and basically lived a contemplative life, right? Basically outside of society in some respects. You also know the story about the John's love and Henry's love for the same woman. You all familiar with that story? And no, so this is why some people suggest Henry was misanthropic, that the trauma was that the woman chose John over Henry. Those damn women. I don't know. No, just kidding. There's more of them than us. I shouldn't talk like this. But yeah, that's kind of the trauma that might have set Henry into being kind of misanthropic, or otherwise deciding not to marry and have kids, which most everybody does, right? That's how I start most of my seminars. I say, let me give you the bad news first. Most of you are going to get married and have kids, right? Just kidding. That's about 95% of us, right? And Henry was part of the 5% that never married or had children. And part of that was because I'm suddenly forgetting her name. I wasn't really preparing to speak about it, but she chose John over Henry. And Henry, started into this contemplative life. So, anyway, anyone have any thoughts so far, comments or questions? So, to get back to this idea of walking, right? Why do we walk? Or how is walking part of thinking? I mean, do you agree with that, Maureen?
Mm-hmm.
And why is that?
I think because in this modern age, we disconnect.
Yeah. And so when you're walking, you connect.
Or you disconnect from,
Oh, walking is your way of disconnecting.
well, you can't look at a computer while you're walking.
Okay, that's true. Some people try. So, all right, so in other words, you're saying in this day and age, the digital age, we're being, the stream is coming in and we have to disconnect. So walking is your way, going into the forest is your way of disconnecting from that so you can hear hear your own thoughts.
When you walk in a city, you always hear the sounds of the city, whether it be traffic, other people talking, noise. And when you're walking in the woods, you're hearing the birds. You're really taking in the nature with all your senses. I guess with the wind, you can smell flowers. You can pretty much see animals, everything. So there's a process that goes on.
I got to move around here to do my slides. So. So anyway, yeah. So this was the amazing thing I came across is that we're all familiar with Walden, we're all familiar with civil disobedience, but here I hold in my hands right now the essay that Thoreau said was really kind of his masterpiece, and it is just one long flowing piece about this process of walking and how walking allowed him to think, allowed him to develop his philosophy. So. Thoreau and his companion Richard Fuller walked to Mount Wachusett on July 19, 1842. They passed through Concord, Acton, Stowe, Bolton, Lancaster, and Sterling, and Princeton. To get there, they stayed at a tavern, I think it's called White's Tavern in Sterling, for one night, and then walked up the next day to the top of Wachusett, where again he meditates on east and west, and perhaps we'll read that section. How many miles is that? Maureen, you said you walked 31 miles?
20.
21, okay. This was a 62-mile walk. 62-mile
How
walk.
many days?
That's a good question. I think they walked it in 2 days. Yeah. Yeah, Thoreau's a prodigious walker. Could you do 60 in a day? Have you ever done 60?
The most I've done in a day is about 35.
35.
I think the more weight you're carrying, the less. If I had a full
Right.
pack, it'd be about 20.
And
It depends on terrain also.
so the one theme that came through to me, which is really interesting, quite different from, well, maybe not totally different from Walden, but certainly different from civil disobedience, is the theme of the essay Walking is all good things are wild and free. So he says, I believe there's a subtle magnetism in nature which, if we unconsciously yield to it, will direct us aright. So Maureen's reflecting this, turn off the computer and get out into the woods, and nature will, whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, nature will make us right. Life consists with wildness. The most alive is the wildest, not yet subdued to man. Its presence refreshes him. I found this really interesting as I was preparing on talking to this, and this is really what I want to talk about with you. I want to kind of draw out of you what we think of these ideas. And then he has this little poem through here all throughout. He has these poems in which he kind of breaks into poetry, and here's one of them. He says, Ben Jonson exclaims, "How near to the good is what is fair." So I would say, now near to the good is what is wild. So he's reversing, in some respects, Ben Jonson's thought and saying that the good is the wild, right? So anyone want to comment on that? I mean, are we willing to accept this? Yes.
He's definitely into nature and animal life and everything. But the flip side of that is, this is all so good and oh so great. The flip side of that is, he's not into interfacing with humanity.
Mhm.
He's got basically not much use for people.
Well, or he would have use for wild people. I agree with you. I agree that what he's saying is that when you go out into nature and experience the wild, the most alive as the wild is, that's when we come in contact with the good. Right? This is very different than the idea that we go to the school committee meeting and vote for the budget, and we're good because of our work on that. Yeah, Duncan?
I think my thoughts are that he thinks, or I think also, nature has one set of rules. It's not as complicated. It's a very complicated organism, but yet what makes it easier if you can just follow one set of rules: life, death, eat, sleep.
So
Where we
nature...
always have, everything we do is so complicated. You sit there and watch animals, which I do a lot, they're always so alert. Their life is not a simple thing. There's no, he broke a window, there's a consequence for it in wildlife. Things like that, where maybe here, because of who you are, you get a special treatment. I think nature is pretty wonderful.
Yeah, no, interesting. So Duncan's just taking us to a place where, when you see animals in the wild, they're very alert, right? That more alert than we have to be in our complicated life. I can't even begin to explain how complicated my day was, let alone my life. It's like I've been all over town. So in nature, Duncan has taken us to a place where in nature you experience that alertness and that simplicity. Is that what you're suggesting? That in nature you encounter something that's...
To me, it seems like he switched the two things, which what I think he seems to be saying is nature is the right way to go about everything, follow.
So my question to you all is, how do you encounter the wild? Or I had another thought too. Let me ask you this first. And I want to partner up and talk about this, because if this is true, if Mike was saying that Thoreau is saying, yes, the wild is good. However, that excludes, our daily grind, our daily, man-made, 8 a.m., get up, blah, blah, blah. If we accept this, then that raises the question, are we in touch with the wild, or what is the wild to us? Right? Because if the wild is the source of the good, and that alertness is the source of the good, and we want to be good, right? Not naturally, human beings, I think, for the most part, we want to be ethical and good. How are we encountering that? That's my question. But first, let me ask you this: does this strike anybody as all good things are wild and free? Does anyone can anyone think of something in our culture or whatnot that does reiterate that does accept that? This idea that wildness is goodness?
Depends on how you define
Sierra
it.
Club.
Sierra Club? Well, Sierra Club, yeah, very much a natural,
The whole movement.
the whole environmental movement. Okay, yes.
It depends upon how you define wild. Unfortunately, the modern world, or at that time when Mr. Thoreau was living, wildness was different from wildness. His wildness was nature. Your wildness is your mental status. You can be violent, talking violent. It depends on how you define wild. This is all that he was interested in, was nature. He's talking about nature. The rest did not matter to him.
But he's also talking about, yes, I'm agreeing with most of what you're saying, although he's suggesting that we're, like let's say we're a Christian. In Christian, goodness emanates from a God figure, right? And manifested by Jesus the Christ, right? If you're a Buddhist, right, goodness emanates from, the Buddha, right, the source of goodness. You see what I'm saying? So Thoreau is really taking us into a kind of a radical idea that the good comes from the wild and the free in a natural setting. You follow? So I think it's not just the wildness. I think it really is an intellectual concept that he's taking us to. And I've had the privilege to have read this, right? And I've been reading this in the last couple of weeks. And it's a very, very challenging in some respects, and I want to take us there. But anyone else want to comment on like what? So, you know, again, growing up, when I was growing up, you know, we grew up listening to Bruce Springsteen, rock and roll. I mean, isn't the theme of rock and roll be wild and free? In fact, isn't there a Rod Stewart song? Young hearts be free tonight, be wild and free.
Born to be wild.
Born to be wild. There you go. Born to be wild.
Born to Run.
Steppenwolf. Born to run.
That's Springsteen, right?
Yeah. So it kind of interested me when I was thinking about tonight. I thought, well, we do have elements of certainly American society and other societies around the world probably as well that we've embraced this cycle. Right? Certainly that's the theme of rock and roll. We could go on and on with anthems of wild and free. So maybe Thoreau, when you talk about Thoreau rising in stature, you know, it's not just Thoreau himself, or it's not just civil disobedience and Martin Luther King, which we'll talk about in a moment, but maybe Thoreau is kind of woven into our culture in a lot of different ways. You follow what I'm saying? But let me ask you this. I want to kind of partner and maybe even talk a little bit, like, how do we encounter the wild? Where do we encounter the wild? Maybe in rock and roll. But, you know, I know Maureen and Bob have shared about going out into the woods. I mean, but Maureen walking the Appalachian Trail, is that the wild?
In
Some of it.
places.
In places, yeah. You encounter bears and stuff like that. That's pretty wild.
That's why.
Yeah, don't you?
And I've had some friends that have gone quite a ways into a place they call, or say, the silence is deafening.
Mm-hmm.
And that, to me, whether Thoreau felt that when he was alive or what, but that's maybe as close as you can get to nature in its realistic state in
Okay.
some ways.
So wilderness experience.
Which you can find almost anywhere. I mean, there's going to be noise, but there's always going to be wildlife right
Where?
outside your door or whatever.
Okay, so you can experience it even in like
Oh, yeah.
Southbridge or Webster or whatnot. There is elements of the wild,
Boston.
even in Boston. But anyone else want to discuss this? Like, how do we experience the wild? I mean, just seeing a squirrel run down the street, is that experiencing the wild? Yes, Jane says yes. Becky?
I think possibly to figure out why animals do what they do. You mentioned squirrels, and my wife and I were talking about it the other day. So I looked it up and wondered why a squirrel makes those quick, when he goes in front of your car, run one way then the other.
Mm.
And that's to alleviate a prey animal getting him.
Mm-hmm.
Those quick movements
Mhm.
are part of his nature to
Mhm.
stay alive.
Mhm.
You don't think he's making a conscious decision and saying, I better get out? He's talking to himself.
No, I think he says,
He says
I
what?
think, I don't know, I think he says I'm gonna get squished.
He says what? Well, he says that means he's talking.
Yeah, well,
Yeah, I'm just really I just have been thinking a lot about this in preparation for tonight and thinking, I think Thoreau is really presenting a very challenging idea here. And in my daily life, you know, my workaday life, you know, and I run, right? So today, it was such a beautiful day, I went out and jogged. And I think some neurologists, like, talk about walking and jogging, that, you know, that motion of left, right, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, is very much the rhythm of meditation, right? Some people say even autistic children do really well biking or walking or running, because that motion kind of settles the cognitive dissonance that they're experiencing. And I think that's very much been a part of my life, right? I've run around the world probably by this point. I don't know, I don't keep track anymore, and I'm getting very, very slow, by the way. It's not even running anymore. It's more shuffling along. But that walking, that shuffling, that running, or that biking, some neurologists are showing that this has a powerful effect on the brain, right? And that the brain gets into, you know, those bliss states that a runner experiences or a walker after going 20 miles or 35 miles walking. Were you feeling good?
I think you feel good after I would say the first quarter mile.
First quarter mile. Maureen, you agree? Other walkers?
Takes me about 3 miles.
3 miles to get into the bliss state?
My husband and I call it the trail, the Zen of
The
the
Zen
trail,
of the
because
trail.
you do get into a very meditational mindset.
What's that? Thinking. When walking, thinking is better when walking.
When you run, how long does it take?
Well, it depends. I'm really
Some days
getting quite old.
Quicker than others?
No, the most I run anymore is about 5 miles. I didn't run 5 today, but I can run 5. And sometimes I'll go, I have these different loops, I'll run 7, but I haven't done that in a long time actually. But I'm more like Bob than Maureen. For me, you know, after I get out there for a couple of 100 yards and shuffling along in that 1, 2, 1, 2, and I just realize I'm in this for
You're in it,
the
yeah.
duration, then my mind settles down, right? If I sit at my desk and try and think, oh my God, you know, you got the phone and the computer and your son, who knows where he is, and your mind just starts, you know, going off onto all kinds of tangents and whatnot. You know, I'm a multitasker, so I'll be doing 3 different things, you know. When you run or walk, that's when you get into, Maureen calls it the Zen of the trail. And I'm curious of whether that's what Thoreau's after here. Not just experiencing something wild in nature, but actually getting to that freedom from, you know, the process of our own thoughts, right? So wildness is being separate from, you know, what we've been taught, right? Separate from all that conditioning and, you know, that human society puts us through.
Excuse me?
Yes.
I've had a thought here, sort of. When I walk, I tend to stop and look at this plant and that plant and the other plant and this bit of bark and, you know, that bit of fungus and that bit of whatever. So I don't think I ever get into the state that you're describing, at least very rarely when I'm, you know, really trying to make time to get from one place to another, which is almost never. So I think it's maybe a different sort of walking and wildness that you encounter when you're out dawdling around looking at this, that, and the other thing, and trying to identify this, that, and the other thing. I think maybe there's more than one kind of walking and one kind of Zen experience.
Almost seems like you get into that Zen because you're stopping, you know, your mind is clear, you're looking at something, you know, it's not all caught up in everything else. You want to see the beauty of the different things as you go along.
Different
So it's
sort
almost
of,
like you are there.
different sort of Zen, perhaps, but definitely not the, not the physical, you know, hormonal, can't think of the name of the
Walker's
hormone
high
we're
or
looking
runner's
for
high.
here, whatever.
Yeah.
Oxytocin, whatever.
Mhm.
Definitely a different sort of an approach to going out and wandering about.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So Virginia is suggesting, I think, more of like a Thoreauian awareness. I mean, because that's what Thoreau became very well known for, right? So his stature is rising partly in natural sciences, right? Because he was such a great observer, right? And so his notebooks. So Virginia is talking, you know, more of what Thoreau was up to. So, but I think he would say, Virginia, it's an awareness, right? That nature takes you to be able to observe. Where I think Maureen and Bob and I are talking about modern man, where we have to get away and somehow feel some sense of joy in our life, you know, you know, run away. Virginia is talking about really what Thoreau is about in some respects, of going out and observing things and noting the plants, noting the, and that's what his notebooks are now quite famous for, right? A lot of people are saying. So actually, in preparation for tonight, I also went back and reread Cape Cod. Has anyone ever read that book? He walks to Cape Cod. He takes 3 walks on Cape Cod. One with Richard Fuller. Is that right? Yeah, I think so.
He had a companion.
He had a companion on that first one, and then he took 2 more. But has anyone ever gone out to the kettle ponds out in Truro? area, Wellfleet and Churro. So he writes very, very beautifully and poetically about that. So I think Virginia's on to really more, taking us back to Thoreau's point, which was awareness, right? And so when he walks the Cape, which I've been reading over the last week or so, it's all about stopping and writing it down.
Can't
So
make
the
30
journey
miles
is
a
more
day that way though.
What's that?
So you can't make 30 miles a day doing that though.
As much as you said he was a prodigious walker, to him it wasn't the miles, because the way that in his writing, it sounds like he did really stop and take in all the beauty of even the very smallest things that maybe would have intrigued him or whatever as he walked along. And of course, he had the luxury of time, which is wonderful. He didn't say I have an hour to take a walk, you know.
No
So,
job, no family, no wife and
So
kids.
he could really meander and really take it all in.
Yeah.
And when you were saying about the wild and free, I was thinking about that a little bit. And I think to myself that wherever you are in nature that makes you feel wild and free,
Mhm.
I think is what kind of speaks to me. Like if I'm at the ocean or,
Mhm.
you know, that kind of thing, where you feel like maybe some of your barriers are gone or
Mhm.
your
Mhm.
inhibitions or whatever are gone,
Mhm.
and you can just be more back to nature, that kind of
Excellent.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, so particularly on the walk to Cape Cod, not so much in this essay actually. I want to get back to this in some respects. Because this again, he claimed he was proudest of. Again, published a few months after his death in the Atlantic Monthly, 1862, the middle of the Civil War. This is not about observation. Interestingly enough, it's very much a philosophical argument, and I want to get to that because I think it is challenging. But I appreciate what everyone is saying. And on the Cape walks, he stopped and talked with people. He talked to the lobsterman. There's a very famous description of the lobsterman's face he meets in Wellfleet. I think he calls it like sheets of sails hanging in the wind. He's describing the guy's cheeks. And the kettle ponds is very, very beautiful writing. If you haven't been to those kettle ponds, I do recommend it. It's not far to get to. And he writes very, very beautiful. These are very, very deep and very clear water peat kettle ponds out in Wellfleet, Churro. And he writes very beautifully about that. I think all of these comments are quite interesting for us and very, very rich. I mean, for my money, I agree with what Kathleen's saying. Like, if you put a gun to my head and said, what do you want to be doing, in the last day of your life? It'd be riding waves. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I just love to body surf, and that is when I feel most close to nature. I'll do that until I die. Yeah, Jane?
They have, they just opened the center at Walden in commemoration of the bicentennial.
Mm-hmm.
And they have an exhibit there where they ask you, the observer, where is your Walden?
Mm-hmm.
Which is really neat.
Mhm.
And it's places all over the world that people have identified. You go, there's like something online, you go on and you push a button, you'll walk.
Mhm.
So you can see the spots that everybody's
Oh,
walking.
wow, that's
Which
cool.
is neat, and you were just describing your Walden.
My Walden's in a wave, absolutely. Where's yours? Where did you put it?
It's in the White Mountains.
The White Mountains?
Camping.
Okay. Yeah, you can still get to wilderness from where we are. I mean, whether it's the Adirondacks, or northern Maine, some parts of New Hampshire, you can get out where you hear the deafening silence.
This is what I've been coming at here. He's been dead about 160 years. Fantastic urbanization in the country.
Mhm.
We're losing more and more people to urbanization. We're losing more and more wilderness. The government's in charge of climate change deniers.
Mhm.
National parks are a bad joke to a big percentage of people in power today. It's all about money.
Mhm.
Thoreau had a lot of facets. He directed his thought out in a lot of directions. I gotta say, I think this is less and less applicable to more and more people now because it's completely alien to them.
Yeah, I mean,
It's still there. You can still find it,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, can you imagine the Stowe and Concord that Thoreau was walking through? It'd be like, I don't know, it'd probably be like the Adirondacks or someplace.
Yeah.
I mean, there'd be a little town, and then there'd be woods. and maybe, some old cow trails and so on. So, yeah, Mike is speaking to, I think, what all of us sense is, some people are talking that we're in the midst of an environmental collapse, right? And that is, I think, that cuts both ways, though. On the one hand, we don't have access to what Thoreau had, but on the other hand, Thoreau is becoming more and more important in this sense. Like, if we lose the wilderness, if we lose the wild, we'll lose the good. And certainly there's evidence for that in the lives of a lot of people. I'm sorry, I have to move around. Actually, I think the next slide we kind of covered, but why don't we move on? Because there's, there's the top of Mount Wachusett. And so again, we've talked about this. How do we encounter the wild? I was going to have us partner, but Thoreau makes the argument in here that walking into the wild is a process of self-purification. And as you purify, whether that's through prayer or mantra or walking or running or whatnot, as you purify, you can hear you're made aright by nature. It's not so much a hearing thing as a kind of whether you call it a soul or the intellect comes in contact with some sort of profound sense of goodness, right? If you purify yourself well enough. Now, Mike's point is very well taken. How do we do that today, right? I had 40 minutes, I went for a jog. I didn't feel totally purified, but I think that it's important for all of us to have some place that we go to try to, align ourselves, right? And that alignment might come from that, rocking back and forth, that bipedalism. So if you go on, Margaret. Interestingly enough, so I want to talk a little bit about Worcester, and this is really interesting too. Not covered here in Walking, but Thoreau lectured in Worcester more often than any other town. And he was drawn by his friendships with H. Blake through the gatherings of Blake's home in Worcester, and also there with Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and others would assemble to hear Blake read Thoreau's letters. So Thoreau was writing these philosophical letters to Blake. And anyone recognize this name, Thomas Wentworth Higginson? Jay?
The armor, what do you say? Is it, oh, it's a
No, not that. Anybody?
He's a transcendentalist, an abolitionist.
He was an abolitionist. He was a colonel in the Civil War. Very, very successful colonel in the Civil War. He was so successful that, in fact, they put him in charge of black regiments. He was a very, very good commander. He was very, very virulent abolitionist, to the point, and I want to talk about this, because we think of Thoreau and civil disobedience and nonviolent, actions, nonviolent protests and whatnot, but Thoreau, along with Higginson, were calling for the overthrow of the government if they didn't back down from slavery. So, also, any poets in the room? Higginson was the one who developed a very close and possibly even romantic relationship with
Dickinson.
Emily Dickinson. That is the same Higginson. So he was a friend of Thoreau, a Civil War hero.
Fabulous book about them, White Heat. I don't know.
White Heat, yeah, Wild Nights, Wild Nights. So he, but it's that's kind of, I'm not going to go there tonight because it's really interesting. Higginson was encouraging her to write. He saw her poetry as extraordinary and beautiful. But he also encouraged her not to publish because he thought her poems were so radical in their style and in their feminism that he encouraged her not to publish because he thought that she'd be torn apart. And so that's kind of complicated right there, right? And she eventually broke off that relationship. And there was pretty clear evidence that they may have made love a few times, which is interesting because you never think of Emily Dickinson as a lover, right? But she did apparently have two lovers, and Higginson being one. But Higginson and Thoreau had much in common, much more in common than the literary and political figures in 19th century. The parallels between Higginson and Thoreau they were both militant abolitionists. They were calling for taking up arms over slavery.
Higginson led the Burns attack on the jail to try and spring Anthony Burns in Boston.
That's correct. That's correct. So because we think of civil disobedience and Martin Luther King and nonviolence and so on, but Thoreau advocated forcible resistance as a legitimate response to a tyrannical government, and they both saw a government that supported slavery is tyrannical, and they were calling, Higginson did take up arms to free a fugitive slave who was jailed.
They were screwing around, they meant it.
Yeah,
Thoreau thought John Brown was just the bee's knees.
I want to talk about that in a moment. So, anyway, I won't go into the Dickinson, but if you can click to the next slide. Yeah, so John Brown there is, this is a famous picture of John Brown where he's swearing that he will take down the government if they don't renounce slavery, right? And this is the seeds of our Civil War, was that abolitionist, transcendentalist Thoreau and Higginson's militancy came to the fore again when they both championed John Brown and the raid in Harper's Ferry, which was 1859. Thoreau met Brown in 1857, the same year he gave this talk in Fitchburg. Interestingly enough, when he visited Concord on a fundraising campaign to acquire arms. And he met him again in 1859 when he returned in search of additional financial support for his tiny army. During these years, Brown gained the admiration of Thoreau, Emerson, Alcott, and other Concordians. What's curious is Thoreau's philosophy has come closer to receiving its due than most American thinkers. Such prominent figures such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King, cited Thoreau as an inspiration because of civil disobedience, right? So this is where we have these conflicted things. In the school we said, oh, Gandhi, Martin Luther King both thought Thoreau was an inspiration because of civil disobedience, that you go to jail or turn your back. But in fact, in real life, Thoreau was raising money for arms for John Brown and supporting Higginson's ideas that look, if the government doesn't renounce slavery, we're going to take up arms, and certainly that's what happened, right, with the Civil War. So if you skip ahead again. So Higginson played a central role in a group called the Secret Six, who brought arms and supplies to anti-slavery forces. Higginson was well positioned to arrange for the provisional pikes and rifles to Brown and his men. In the aftermath of the bloody foray into Harper's Ferry, which ended with Brown's capture and led to his execution, in 1859, Higginson, like Thoreau, continued to hope that Brown's violent example would inspire the people of Massachusetts to take up arms against federal authorities, thereby provoking, if not a general insurrection, then at least consistent resistance to any law that upheld the rights of slaveholders. Not the history we've been taught, interestingly enough. And certainly, doesn't that gets really complicated right there, right? Doesn't it? I mean, because if you follow, American militias right now, I mean, this is kind of what they're about, right? They're saying we're arming ourselves and preparing and training in case the government becomes tyrannical, right? So that's.
There was a U.S. Marshal that
Go ahead.
The militia that is being trained today is not being trained to overcome the government. It is taken as a reserve in case we go to war or we need defense forces. So
the National Guard.
Yes, the militia has always been there.
Yes.
Understand? But the way the government is financing it now and paying for it is to have defensive forces. The militia is not for what is being suggested by Mr. Brown and you.
Okay. Which militia are you referring to?
I can't hear you.
Which militia are you referring to?
I'm talking of any militia that is formed. It's not formed nowadays by the civil people, by the local people. It is being formed by the government.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not a militia.
I understand.
Understand? So that's what I'm saying. So the
Yeah,
National Guard is a militia formed by the government. It will not go against the government. That was a different time.
But if you follow someone like, there's many examples of this, including Charlottesville, most recently. But if you follow Randy Weaver, right, some of the militias out west, the case about the grazing rights in Oregon, there are people arming and training in the event that the government turns tyrannical.
I agree with you there, but they are called illegal.
Yes, they are.
They are illegal.
They are. Well,
what you're talking about is the legality of militia.
It's legal to own the hardware, that's for sure. In fact, I'm having this discussion in Dudley because somebody shoots down the road from me, and when I call the police and say they're disturbing the peace, the police say this is lawful, and they're using high caliber, rapid repeating rifles. It is lawful on some level, but I'm not prepared to speak to that exactly, but I think it's just an interesting point, right? That certainly we see slavery as a historical crime. And we see the results of it in a lot of different ways. I certainly do at Worcester State University, where we have a lot of African students, a lot of Latino students. The effects of slavery are long-lasting. And Thoreau and Higginson were part of efforts to arm people against the government if the federal agents did not renounce slavery or try and protect the slaveholders. As Mike is referring to, Higginson did take up arms to free a fugitive slave who was imprisoned in Boston, a gentleman named Burns.
There was a U.S. Marshal that went to Worcester, and I think Higginson brought out 1,000 people. I can't think of the guy's name now, I can't remember.
The Marshal's name?
The Marshal's
Yeah.
name.
I don't know it either. But anyway, I just think this is interesting. Thoreau hoped that the people of Massachusetts would take up Brown's examples to fight for freedom. He held a public response to Brown's arrest in Concord on October 30th, 1859. He gave the same speech in Boston on November 1st and Worcester on November 3rd. Thoreau honored Brown in the last talk he gave. So, a virulent abolitionist. Virulent abolitionist. So, let's go on from there. So, I want to go back to this idea. So, one of the common tenets of ancient philosophy, right, so when you talk about the philosophy of Buddha or Plato or Jesus or Aristotle or was abandoned at some point, maybe beginning with Descartes, right? And it's this: the person could not have access to the truth without undertaking a process of self-purification, right? That would render them susceptible to knowing the truth, right? Now, this is abandoned on some level when we begin to think of the mind and body as different and whatnot. But Thoreau returns to this idea, and this idea of purification came about from walking. Walking helped to cultivate one's receptivity to the beauty of the universe. He wrote, "The perception of beauty is a moral test." This may get back to Virginia's point about how she walks and her perception and whatnot, right? So, I'd like to talk about this with you, because I think it's quite a challenging idea. So based on his walk to Cape Cod in 1850, Henry David Thoreau lectured at Fitchburg and in Worcester in 1857, but the essay, as I've talked about, was first given in Concord in 1851. Thoreau submitted it as a final essay to the Atlantic Monthly just before his death in 1862. The final version of the essay he was proudest of was published after his death. He uses walking to speak literally about freedom and other aspects of this here, having access to the truth. Everyone following? All right, so Mike, go ahead.
How much of this do you think came from the fact that he had access to Emerson's library and he read Emerson's books on the Near Eastern religion?
Yeah, very good. Margaret Fuller, Emerson were very...
Margaret Fuller thought he was a dog breath.
But Margaret Fuller was instrumental in bringing Eastern philosophy to Concord. Margaret Fuller and Emerson, Thoreau. Yeah, to be honest, I'm not going to go there in particular, but they say when he was at Walden, he used to go in on Sundays and have pot roast and do his laundry, and Lydia Emerson, or whatever Emerson's wife's name was fine with washing his clothes, and that there was a real patriarchal aspect to this all. You may be right that his access to Emerson influenced this. But Thoreau went to Harvard. Okay, Thoreau was no slouch. I mean, he was recognized.
But he wasn't perceived that way for a long time.
He was perceived as a bit of a mountain man, a bit of a misanthrope, but he was certainly influential in his time. And I believe, I'm not remembering exactly, but there was one of his professors at Harvard kind of rated him as most likely to succeed. He was a brilliant guy. That he turned away. Again, that's the discussion. Is it because the girlfriend picked John? Who knows? Is it because of some other aspect of his personality that made him basically not marry, not join society in any way, and become, as we've observed tonight, hey, if I don't have a job, Well, I won't go there, actually, I was going to use an analogy, but if I don't have a job and a kid and a wife, yeah, I'm going to be writing a lot more poetry than I am right now, let me put it that way. I carve out time to take my run and play my guitar at this point, right? Go on one more step. This is Fitchburg from a lithograph, but Thoreau lectured on walking or wild in Fitchburg on February 3rd, 1857. Like most of his lectures, walking evolved over time from passages in his journal, but the gestation period in this case was especially long. Having first given it in Concord in 1851, he delivered various versions over the next 10 years. Now, he started the journal about walking on the Wachusett Walk, right? So 1842, he delivered the first lecture, 1851 in Concord, and he delivered various versions over the next 10 years and submitted it again as his final essay just before his death. So let's go on, Margaret, and I want to leave time for a little bit of a discussion here. In the essay Nature, Michael liked this. Emerson asserts that there can be found in the natural world a sanctity which shames our religions. Thoreau would agree completely with this statement. Everyone following, right? So most of you have probably read Emerson's Nature. Kind of a magnificent essay. But Emerson, in the same essay, suggests that nature is emblematic of higher truths. And the material world has value by virtue of being a subsidiary product of mental reality, right? So this is Plato. This is Christianity, this is Buddha, everyone following this? So Emerson says, oh yeah, nature is the source of a goodness, however, it's emblematic of higher reality, right? Now here, this is the point of, perhaps the point of tonight, is that in walking, Thoreau turns away from his master, right, Emerson, and he says, for Emerson, each natural object is therefore the symbol of some spiritual fact. In walking, Thoreau rejects this central teaching of his primary mentor. He recoils from the idea that we could have some kind of higher reality by looking beyond nature, and he concludes. See, I think this is really quite fascinating, and very challenging too, because don't we all think, like we're walking through, Emerson talked about walking through the forest, and you're like walking through God's hair and the eye of the pond and whatnot. So nature was emblematic of God, of the Creator. Thoreau concludes opposite that. He rejects Emerson's idea that this is some sort of spiritual test. He says, so this is the way walking ends. This is the last passage of walking. So saunter toward the Holy Land, till one day the sun shall shine more brightly than ever he has done, shall perchance shine into our minds and hearts and light up our whole lives with a great awakening light, as warm and serene and golden as on a bankside in autumn. So for Thoreau, nature is not emblematic of the spiritual, right? The awakening, the great truth is nature itself. Is everyone following this idea? So for Plato, Emerson is being very Platonic there. For Plato, everything was just a reflection of the heaven, right? And Emerson seems to point in that direction too. Not Thoreau. Thoreau is saying nature is it. Nature is where the goodness comes from. Open your heart to let the sun shine in, and you'll experience the good of the world. And I don't know, so how do we see this? Are we all able to...
Why do you think he refers to it as the Holy Land in capitalization?
Because that is it. The Holy Land is not paradise. The Holy Land is not heaven. The Holy Land is here. Right? Walk into the Holy Land. And the Holy Land is going through this process of awakening to this truth. Yes?
I do not know much about Mr. Thoreau as a person. Do you think he was agnostic? I'm asking you because you studied it. I don't know. The way you talk about him here sounds like an agnostic.
I wouldn't say agnostic. I would say... Jane?
Does this mean that he's a pantheist or a panentheist?
Yeah, I think, you know, I don't want to try and label it. I just find it very fascinating. And again, thank Margaret for inviting me to go to look into this again, because when I was teaching Thoreau, this is not when I was teaching to the kids. I was taking them to Concord. We were talking about Walden and civil disobedience. This, you know, now at mid-age, I find this very, very fascinating and very challenging too. I think Jane is saying, is it pantheistic? Yeah, I think on some level, but pantheism is many gods. Pantheism is multiple gods, right? I think Thoreau is saying there ain't no God.
You know, this presented to me in some books I read as an anti-clerical. He didn't have too much use for Protestant clergymen and their preachings. He did find a few he liked, but most of the time he thought it was bullshit.
Yeah, perhaps that's why he liked Emerson, because, you know, Emerson renounced the cloth, right? Emerson stepped away from the most prestigious podium of the time, and his father's, First Congregational Church in Boston, right? So maybe that's why Thoreau got along with Emerson, because Emerson had turned away from that. I don't know what you would call this. I think that, you know, this is saying that it's all around us all the time, right? And that wildness and goodness is something that we can access through walking. And walk, whether you call it the Holy Land or not, or call it the streets of Southbridge. And I find this very quite radical. You know, I think it's what you might call classical radical. Well, no, actually not. I think actually Emerson would be more kind of a classical radical, because he's embracing the Platonic idea, right? That heaven is there, and we're all in a reflection of heaven. Thoreau's saying that's not it. He's turning away from his master and saying it's just nature. Anyone want to discuss?
He's more like Blake,
Well, but Blake was very much about heaven.
but heaven in a grain of sand, and that.
See the world in a grain of sand,
Yeah.
see the universe in a grain of sand. But Blake was very religious. Although I know what you're getting at, that Blake had this ecstatic, you know, nature.
Mystical.
Yeah. But Blake believed he was seeing angels, and he was going to heaven. He had a divine soul. Virgin?
How about a Native American sensibility towards nature? I think that Thoreau might have been picking up on some ideas
Mhm.
like that from Native American contacts or
Mhm.
ideas.
Could be, but the Native Americans often had spiritual, traditions.
Oh, unquestionably, but they also had an incredible respect for nature as it existed, and a belief that that was a different way of viewing our relationship to the natural world, I think, than the basic European colonists.
Yeah, no, I agree. But I also think most Indian tribes had some sort of construct of heaven or the beyond, the white buffalo and all that. I think that, what interested me about this, and is the library closing, or do I have more time? We're
We should
closed.
wrap up in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Please.
My point in this is, I'm not necessarily trying to tip over the apple cart all that much, but what I find interesting is that it is central Massachusetts where all this developed, right? So the walk to Wachusett, when he starts writing this essay, the many lectures in Worcester, in which he, basically becomes a militant, calling for the overthrow of the government, to the later lecture in Fitchburg, when he's continuing to work on walking, it is in central Mass where some of these ideas develop. And I think, as I was reading this and preparing for tonight, I thought, wow, this is really so radical. It's such a radical idea. And maybe it's the idea that will save us. As Mike portrayed the world that we're facing right now, if we don't preserve the wild, if we don't make efforts to preserve the wild, we are losing our homeland on some level, right? And maybe that's how we should be teaching it, rather than be a good boy and girl and you won't go to jail, or be a good boy and you'll go to heaven, Thoreau is saying, it's here, it's all here. Open your heart, let the sun shine in. Maybe that doesn't seem so radical to us right now. Maybe some of us have adopted that idea. I kind of am conflicted about it, to be honest with you. But there it is. This is the way he closes this beautiful essay, which I recommend everybody read. I really do. I think it'll take you to a Thoreau that very different from Walden, very different from civil disobedience. It's very much a meditation, a philosophical meditation on these matters of where do you see the truth, and how you access the truth. And certainly that's critical in our time when we got fake news all around us.
More of it.
More of it every day.
Every hour.
Comments, questions, anything at all?
Under the influence of the Thoreau biography, I ran off to 8 books and bought a copy of his journals for $100.
Did you?
Oh my God. It's 2 gigantic ledges, small print, just goes on forever. The guy didn't do anything but write. They've got every bit of it, and it's still in my closet. It's been there for 3 years. I'm going to die, I'll never read it. There's just so much of it.
Never owned a home, no wife, no kids. Lee Emerson doing his wash. What could be better than that? Hey, I'm going to go walk Cape Cod. See you later. He'd go out for...
Well, he made pencils for the old man, too. He made pencils when he had tuberculosis, and he was breathing all that dust, and it didn't do him any good.
He went up to Mount Katahdin also.
Yes.
They named a spring after him up there.
Is that right? Some people say he walked around Webster Lake. I've never found that. Maybe Mike will find that.
I never heard that.
Never heard that? Some people say he walked over this way.
It's tough. They didn't do much about Webster or Dudley in the Worcester papers, and the Webster paper didn't start till 1859, so,
Still Indian territory. Well, I will end with an anecdote. When I go out walking and try and encounter nature in my very hectic life, I like to golf. Right? I'm not a very good golfer, but I really love golf, actually. I love it because I walk. I walk a lot, and I walk fast when I'm trying to golf. And so, but I take lessons because I'm so bad at it. And my teacher, whose name is Jeff Gordon, always says to me, I said, Jeff, I'm doing what you say, but I'm still a terrible golfer. What's going on? Because, of course, George Bernard Shaw famously called golf a nice day and a nice walk ruined, right? And Jeff always looks at me and says, do you have a wife? Yes. Do you have a job? Yes. Do you have a kid? Yes. And he says, you'll never be a good golfer. And that's the triple truth, and that's what we're getting from Thoreau too. I mean, but I do recommend this. I only have this one copy, but thank you, Margaret, for inviting me. This has been a great journey for me, just to go in and look at this essay, which again, Thoreau thought was his masterpiece, which I'd never really encountered up close. I knew that he'd written about walking, and that's why I went to it. I know that he'd walked to Wachusett, and that he'd written about walking, and I went and looked, and here it is. Here's the posthumous essay he was most proud of. And it has nothing to do with society. It has nothing to do with civil disobedience or nonviolence or whatever. It's all about this process of purifying to get to the truth. And it's really quite fascinating. It's a beautiful piece. Very much a philosophical essay. So, again, thank you. And
thank you very much.
I think we need to come back and we need to do something on Thomas Wentworth Higginson and Emily Dickinson. I think that might be interesting.
Yeah, we'd be delighted if you would see her.
I think that would be interesting for all of us.
Thank you very much. I think it's really appropriate that you focus on the walking aspect of October and how it plays into the many years. I think it must be around 15 years now that the Last Green Valley is doing their program. So I think you've really set a very high bar for anything we do in the future in this regard. And thank you for the new insights and looking at Thoreau in a whole different way. This is our last in the series, and I think you've given us an awful lot of food for thought. So
great.
thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Monica.
And please take a cookie.